Melanie throws a surprise birthday party for Ashley, and Scarlett goes to the lumberyard to delay Ashley. Scarlett and Ashley talk wistfully about the old days before the war. Scarlett finally allows herself to look back on old memories and begins to understand that Ashley's unhappiness stems from the loss of the Southern gentleman's way of life. Her passion for Ashley feels dim now, replaced by a friendly, sympathetic love. Scarlett begins to cry and Ashley takes her in his arms to comfort her. Ashley stiffens, and Scarlett turns to see that Archie and India, Ashley's sister, have been watching them. Archie tells Rhett about the scene. Scarlett, knowing the story will spread, dreads facing the party. Rhett berates her, calls her coward, and forces her to go to the party. Scarlett realizes that she cares about no one's judgment but Melanie's. When Scarlett enters the party, everyone falls silent and turns to stare. Melanie emerges from the crowd, takes Scarlett's hand, and asks Scarlett to receive the guests with her. That night Scarlett paces frantically in her room, unable to abandon the memory of Melanie's fierce faithfulness to her. She slips downstairs to find some brandy and encounters Rhett, who is drunk and angry. He tells Scarlett that he loves her and that he would kill her if he thought it could take Ashley from her mind. Suddenly Rhett seizes her in his arms and carries her upstairs, tearing her clothes off and kissing her roughly. After a wild night, Scarlett wakes with new passion for Rhett. She is nervous and excited to see Rhett again, but he has left and does not return for several days. He returns and nonchalantly tells her he has been at Belle's. They exchange harsh words, and Rhett tells Scarlett that he is taking Bonnie on a long trip. Melanie continues to support Scarlett faithfully and openly breaks with India's camp. All of Atlanta's prominent families choose sides, and the feud splits the town in two, ending Ashley's relationship with India and Melanie's relationship with Aunt Petit Pat, in whose house India lives. Scarlett reflects that both she and Ashley must now hide behind Melanie's protective strength. Rhett stays away for 3 months, and Scarlett misses him terribly. She discovers that she got pregnant the night before Rhett left, and for once the news of pregnancy makes her happy. Rhett mocks Scarlett upon returning. She angrily tells him of her pregnancy and he replies, "Cheer up, maybe you'll have a miscarriage." Enraged, Scarlett swings at him. Rhett steps out of the way, and Scarlett falls down a long staircase. As a result of her fall, she loses the baby and nearly dies. Melanie stays by her side. Rhett, frantic with guilt, weeps and tells Melanie that he loves Scarlett and fears that he has killed her with his crazed jealousy. A month later, Scarlett goes to Tara to recuperate. Rhett tells Melanie he wants Ashley to buy the mills from Scarlett. He will anonymously give Ashley the money to make the purchase, and Melanie must encourage Ashley to buy the mills. Hopeful that if Ashley owns the mills, Beau might attend Harvard and Scarlett might worry less, Melanie reluctantly agrees. Ashley buys the mills, and the four have a little party to celebrate. But Scarlett denounces Ashley's plan to fire Johnny Gallagher and send away the convicts. Ashley replies that ill-gotten money cannot make anyone happy. Scarlett protests, but when Rhett asks her sardonically whether her money has made her happy, she falls silent. Rhett devotes his time and attention to Bonnie and to the Democratic Party. He reveals that he and Ashley disbanded Georgia's Ku Klux Klan by convincing its members that it was counterproductive. By October of 1871, the efforts of men like Rhett and Ashley bring back a Democratic majority in the state legislature, effectively ending Reconstruction. Bonnie becomes increasingly spoiled, and Rhett does nothing to curb her desires. She likes to ride, so he buys her a little Shetland pony and teaches her to jump obstacles. One day Bonnie asks Rhett for a higher bar, and, against his better judgment, Rhett complies. Her eyes flashing like Gerald's, Bonnie calls out to Scarlett to "Watch me take this one." Remembering her father uttering the same words before his death, Scarlett cries out to Bonnie to stop, but it is too late. The pony misses the jump, throwing Bonnie to her death. Rhett sequesters himself in his room with the dead child, refusing to bury her because of her fear of the dark. Scarlett accuses Rhett of murdering Bonnie, and Rhett responds that Scarlett never cared for Bonnie. Melanie hurries to Rhett's side. She persuades him to let Bonnie's funeral go forward and sits up all night with Bonnie's body as Red sleeps. Some weeks after the funeral, Scarlett grows afraid and lonely and wishes Red would comfort her, but he is constantly drunk, hostile, and bitter. His physical condition deteriorates and he spends much of his time at Belle Watling's. Scarlett longs to tell him that she does not blame him for Bonnie's death, but she cannot approach him. She even longs for the company of her old friends, but she has alienated everyone except Melanie, Ashley, and Aunt Patty Pat. Scarlett is in Marietta, Georgia, when she receives an urgent telegram from Red saying that Melanie is dying. Scarlett rushes home, where she finds Melanie on her deathbed. Although Melanie was forbidden to have more children because of her frailty, she got pregnant and had a miscarriage, and the effort has doomed her. Suddenly realizing how much strength she has drawn from Melanie over the years, how much Melanie has done to protect her, and how much she has wronged Melanie, Scarlett feels a desperate sense of loss. At Melanie's bedside, Scarlett promises to look after Ashley and Bo. She seeks Ashley to take comfort in his strength, but when she sees him broken and weak, she realizes that she must have loved the fantasy that she created, not the man before her. Scarlett goes outside to clear her head, distraught by the loss of both Melanie and her fantastical love for Ashley. Walking through a thick mist, she realizes with terror that her surroundings exactly mirror those of her recurring nightmare in which she runs through a fog looking for something, not knowing what she hopes to find. She begins to run, and suddenly she realizes that she wants to find Red. Immediately she understands that she loves him and that he has loved her all along. No longer afraid and sad, she runs joyfully home to him. When Scarlett confesses her feelings to Red, he tearfully tells her that his love for her has worn out and that he is going away. Unmoved by her passionate pleas, Red says he is going to search for a calm, dignified life like the one he and the South lost in the war. Scarlett asks what she will do if he leaves her, and he says their relationship cannot be fixed. He parts with the words, "My dear, I don't give a damn." Scarlett collapses in misery and shock, but suddenly she decides she must go back to Tara. There, she thinks, Mammy will comfort her. Scarlett believes she will recuperate and grow strong again and find a way to win Red back, just like the spirited people in the Old South who would not know defeat, even when it stared them in the face. Scarlett feels comforted and stronger and refuses to think of her pain until tomorrow, falling back on her mantra, "Tomorrow is another day." On the morning of the Wilkes' party, Scarlett chooses a dress that will show off her 17-inch waist. Mammy persuades Scarlett to eat something to discourage an unladylike appetite at the barbecue. Ellen cannot attend the barbecue because she must go over the plantation accounts with Jonas Wilkerson before he leaves Tara. On the road, the O'Haras meet the Talton women. Gerald and feisty Mrs. Talton talk about horses and the possibility of war. Scarlett barely listens, and even the mention of Ashley's engagement fails to disrupt her daydreams of eloping with him. All the county's best families have arrived at 12 Oaks. Scarlett notices a tall, dark, and powerfully built man staring at her without proper deference. His boldness thrills and shocks her. She learns that he is Red Butler, a scandalous man from an aristocratic family in Charleston, South Carolina. Red once took a girl out without a chaperone and then refused to marry her, though he should have married her after such outrageous behavior. In defense of his sister's honor, the girl's brother challenged Red to a duel. Red killed the brother during the duel. Scarlett commands the largest circle of suitors and admirers at the barbecue, including Charles Hamilton. Charles, Melanie's timid brother, showers Scarlett with awkward attention. He even proposes to her, although he's already Honey Wilkes' beau. Scarlett hardly hears Charles, fixing her attention on Ashley. Sitting with Melanie, he seems oblivious to Scarlett's admirers. The talk of war has attracted men young and old, who boast that they will defeat the Yankees in a month or less. Red contemptuously interjects that there are no cannon factories in the South, only a few iron foundries, and no naval power to keep the southern ports open. He claims that the Yankees will prevail easily and excuses himself before the outraged man can respond. After the women and girls go upstairs to take their afternoon naps, Scarlett slips into the dark library to intercept Ashley. When Ashley enters, Scarlett confesses her love. To her dismay, he says that he plans to marry Melanie and tells her that she would come to hate him if they were married because they are too different to make a good match. Her pride stung, Scarlett slaps him. He walks quietly out of the room and she hurls a bowl at the wall, shattering it. Unbeknownst to Scarlett, Rhett has been lying on the couch, and he sits up and teases her about her unladylike manner. Furious and humiliated, Scarlett storms out with all the dignity she can muster. She goes upstairs and overhears Honey jealously telling Melanie that Scarlett is fast. To Scarlett's disgust, Melanie, who can see only the good in people, defends Scarlett. Scarlett runs back downstairs just as news arrives that President Lincoln has called for troops, signaling the start of the Civil War. Charles spots Scarlett and again asks her to marry him. Seeing an opportunity to hurt Ashley and Honey and salvage her own pride, Scarlett accepts. The next months pass in a blur. Scarlett and Charles marry just one day before Melanie and Ashley's wedding. The men then go off to war and Charles dies of measles only 2 months later. Scarlett gives birth to a son and names him Wade Hampton Hamilton, after Charles's commanding officer. Scarlett hates the restrictive and boring life of a widowed mother, hates the general excitement over the war, and hates that Ashley is married. She takes a trip to Atlanta to stay with Melanie and her aunt, Petit Pat. The war drags on. Port blockades make food, clothing, and other necessities increasingly difficult to obtain. Rhett is the most famous Confederate blockade runner, sneaking boats through the Yankee blockade in order to sell cotton and other Southern products in exchange for necessities. He becomes the most popular man in town despite his reputation for disregarding social customs. He calls on Scarlett frequently, and she quickly abandons any pretense of mourning Charles's death. She enjoys the informality occasioned by the war and lives an active social life. After months of polite behavior, Rhett starts publicly expressing his contempt for Confederate idealism and declares that he works for personal gain, not for the Southern cause. One night at a party, Rhett scandalizes his audience by exclaiming that the war is about money, not pride, rights, or glory. In the carriage ride home, Melanie defends Rhett, revealing that in his letters Ashley has expressed beliefs similar to Rhett's. The revelation that her shining idol and a scoundrel have the same opinions about the war confuses Scarlett. The entire city, with the exception of the Hamilton household, vilifies Rhett. He continues to call on Scarlett, however, and gives her a fancy hat from Paris so she will stop wearing the required black mourning veil. One day Melanie tells Scarlett that a prostitute named Belle Watling gave her a considerable sum of money for the hospital. Belle wrapped the money in a handkerchief, which Melanie now holds, and Scarlett sees that it bears Rhett's initials. Shocked that Rhett would consort with a prostitute, Scarlett flings the handkerchief into the fire. The people remain optimistic despite food shortages, death, illness, and poverty. The Confederacy has won important battles, and rumors begin to circulate that the war will be settled at an impending battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. As the battle begins, news of widespread casualties slowly trickles back to Atlanta. A large crowd of women gathers before the newspaper office to wait for casualty lists. Melanie, Scarlett, and Petit Pat learn that Ashley has survived, but nearly every family in Atlanta has lost a relative in the fighting. Stuart and Brent Tarleton have died. The Confederacy loses the battle at Gettysburg. At Christmas time, Ashley comes home on a brief leave of absence. Scarlett loves seeing him, but wishes she could speak to him alone. Just before he leaves, she gets a moment with him. Ashley asks Scarlett to look after Melanie if he is killed. Scarlett quickly agrees and then kisses him passionately. Ashley kisses her back but quickly breaks away as Scarlett proclaims her love, and he hurries to the train station looking agonized. It is early in 1864. The Confederate Army has lost ground and Atlanta suffers from cold and hunger. Atlanta openly reviles Rhett as a food speculator and a profiteer. Scarlett receives 2 devastating pieces of news: Ashley has been captured, and Melanie is pregnant. Rhett has learned of Ashley's imprisonment and tells Scarlett that Ashley could have won his freedom by betraying the Confederacy. Scarlett asks why Ashley would have refused such an opportunity, and Rhett, who claims he himself would have accepted, replies contemptuously that Ashley is too much of a gentleman. Rhett, as a symbol of the New South, forces the people around him to listen to the harsh truths about the war, pointing out the economic problems that Southern leaders refuse to acknowledge. Although he's abrasive and contemptuous, Rhett cuts through the rosy rhetoric of leaders like Dr. Meade and exposes the hypocrisies and weaknesses obscured by the South's rampant patriotism. Rhett insists on voicing truths that the South would rather not face. He asserts that the war is more about money than people will admit, and that those who make grand speeches about states' rights care for nothing but their own wealth and privilege. Ashley also recognizes the truths that Rhett voices, but, as Scarlett realizes, Ashley nevertheless resigns himself to fighting for a lost cause. Ashley reinforces his position as symbol of the Old South, fighting desperately for a life that has already been lost to the New South that Rhett Butler represents. Rhett comes to visit and reminds Scarlett that he loaned her the money to buy the mill on condition that she refrain from using the money to help Ashley. Noting that Ashley is now being paid to run the mill, Rhett tells Scarlett she has become unscrupulous. Scarlett insists that she had no choice and says she will be kind once she is rich and secure. Laughing, Rhett tells her to urge Frank to spend more nights at home. Scarlett thinks Rhett is insinuating that Frank is having an affair, but Rhett laughs and departs, leaving Scarlett confused and angry. By March, Georgia has come under harsh military rule for its refusal to grant the vote to blacks. Tensions mount between the freed blacks, the Confederate whites, the Yankee soldiers, and the Ku Klux Klan. One day, driving through the dangerous black area of Shantytown, Scarlett encounters Big Sam, who is wanted for killing a Yankee. Scarlett decides to help him escape to Tara and tells him to meet her in the same spot that night. She rides to the mill, where she finds that Johnny Gallagher has been starving and whipping the convicts. She flies into a rage, but Johnny threatens to quit unless she gives him free rein to do as he pleases. Remembering that he has doubled the mill's productivity, Scarlett lets the matter drop. On her way back through Shantytown, Scarlett is attacked by a poor white man and his black companion. Big Sam appears and fights the attackers. He then jumps into Scarlett's carriage and drives her to safety as she collapses in sobs. That night, Frank sends Scarlett to Melanie's house while he and Ashley attend a political meeting. At Melanie's, the other women and Archie seem strangely tense. Rhett appears and asks Melanie where Ashley and Frank have gone, saying that it is a matter of life and death. Melanie tells him they have gone to the old Sullivan plantation, and Rhett disappears. Melanie explains to Scarlett that Frank and Ashley are Klansmen, as are all the men they know, and they have gone to avenge the attack on Scarlett. A Yankee regiment bursts in and demands to know the men's location. At last Rhett, Ashley, and a man named Hugh Elsing stumble in drunkenly. Rhett tells the Yankee captain that he and the other men were at Belle Watling's house all night. The Yankee, a friend of Rhett's, is suspicious but embarrassed, and he quickly departs. Rhett dispatches Archie to burn the Klan robes and dispose of 2 unspecified dead bodies. Ashley is not drunk but wounded, and Scarlett realizes the whole scene has been a desperate cover-up. In her concern for Ashley, Scarlett hardly notices Frank's absence. Rhett finally informs her that Frank has been shot through the head. The next day, a Yankee court calls Belle, Ashley, and Rhett to testify about the events of the preceding evening, and their convincing alibi clears them of all charges. Melanie expresses her gratitude and admiration to Belle, who is dumbstruck that a great lady like Melanie has stooped to speak to a prostitute. The other Confederate women in Atlanta look down on Scarlett for her connection to the preceding evening's events. Scarlett sits alone in her bedroom, drinking brandy and feeling sick with guilt. She believes that she manipulated Frank into marrying her and then caused his death. Rhett arrives and proposes to Scarlett. Surprised, Scarlett refuses and tells Rhett that she does not love him. Rhett tells her to marry him for fun. He takes her in his arms and kisses her deeply. Feeling dizzy and faint, Scarlett accepts the proposal. Rhett says he must leave for a long trip, but that they will be married when he returns. Atlanta is scandalized to hear about Scarlett's engagement to Rhett, but Scarlett ignores the gossip, marries Rhett, and goes to New Orleans for a long honeymoon. The defeated Confederate Army abandons Atlanta and retreats south, leaving the city to the Yankees. Scarlett goes to the depot to find Dr. Meade and encounters a seemingly endless trail of dead and dying soldiers. Dr. Meade cannot leave them to help Melanie, and everyone else is evacuating the city. Melanie goes into labor, and Prissy admits to Scarlett that she lied when she claimed to know how to deliver a baby. For the first time in her life, Scarlett strikes a slave, slapping Prissy across the face. Scarlett hurries to try to help Melanie. After a long, painful labor, Melanie gives birth to a boy. Atlanta is nearly deserted, but Scarlett sends Prissy to find Rhett and tell him to come help them escape to Tara. Confederate soldiers confiscate Rhett's horse and carriage, but he steals an old horse and cart and drives away with the women, Wade, and the baby. The retreating Confederate Army has torched Atlanta's foundries and storehouses to keep the Yankees from looting them. Scarlett feels unutterably grateful for Rhett's strength and protection as they ride through the blazing streets. At last they make it out of Atlanta, and Scarlett repeats her desire to go to Tara. Rhett says that to do so would be suicidal, as the woods near Tara are full of Yankees. To Scarlett's shock, Rhett announces that he is abandoning her to join the Confederate Army. He kisses Scarlett passionately, overwhelming her with unfamiliar feelings. Her fury at his announcement quickly returns, though, and she slaps him. He walks away, and Scarlett takes the reins. The next morning, Scarlett finds herself in pain after a long night of driving and sleeping in the woods. Melanie seems near death, and Scarlett whips the sickly horse back onto the road. Scarlett longs for the comfort of her mother and Tara. They pass the neighboring manors, all empty and burned, but find Tara still standing. Gerald greets Scarlett with the news that Ellen died the previous day. Scarlett's sisters are still sick with typhoid fever. Gerald seems like a helpless old man, so Scarlett takes charge. Gerald tells her that the Yankees used Tara as a headquarters and have ravaged the plantation, stripping it of food. Dilsey recently gave birth, so she nurses Melanie's child. Mammy seems to lack strength and confidence without Ellen, and Dilsey tells Scarlett that the Yankees have burned all the cotton and that Ellen died crying the name Philippe. Scarlett drinks some whiskey and sinks into despair. She remembers her proud family history and thinks of her ancestors who overcame hardships and won fortunes. Feeling strengthened by their example, Scarlett falls into a peaceful, drunken sleep. Scarlett wakes in the morning with a headache. She realizes that Gerald, who seemed merely weary the previous night, is suffering from dementia and does not understand that Ellen is dead. Scarlett goes to 12 Oaks to search for food and finds old turnips and cabbages. As she eyes the torched remains of the once great plantation, she resolves to look forward rather than backward and vows to herself, "I'm never going to be hungry again." The war soon fades from Scarlett's mind as she devotes herself to feeding the hungry mouths of Tara, tending to the 3 sick girls, and struggling to stay afloat. Scarlett hardens and grows sharp-tongued under the strain and worry of being in charge, but she gains strength from her deep connection to Tara and her passion to hold on to the land. Scarlett's whiskey-induced flashback to her ancestors' struggles illustrates the power of the human will to overcome even the most severe adversity. Mitchell's flashback technique, though less than subtle, reminds us that Scarlett's situation is not unique and that she must fall back on the human capacity to meet unthinkable challenges. Other characters also exhibit strength of will and help guide Scarlett's actions. As a child, old Miss Fontaine witnessed the scalping of her entire family and survived. She recognizes the survival instinct in Scarlett and gives Scarlett advice based upon her own experiences. Rhett was thrown out of his house without a penny, but he manages to amass great wealth. Melanie gives birth almost unaided but never relinquishes her optimism. She exhibits incredible strength by doing hard work despite her physical weakness. Scarlett, Rhett, and Melanie could not be more different from one another, but they all possess wells of strength, and Mitchell celebrates their ability to survive the most difficult ordeals. One day a Yankee cavalryman rides up to Tara and enters the house with his pistol drawn, looking for loot. Scarlett shoots him point blank with Charles's pistol. As he falls down dead, she sees Melanie at the top of the stairs carrying Charles's sword. For the first time, Scarlett feels admiration for Melanie. They discover money in the Yankees' pockets. Though shocked by the thought that she has killed, Scarlett feels justified in defending Tara and happy to have the Yankees' precious money and horse. Scarlett visits the nearby Fontaine plantation and finds the women eager to share their meager supplies. Scarlett tells her troubles to old Miss Fontaine, who warns Scarlett to save something to fear lest she become too cold and hardened. To Scarlett's chagrin, old Miss Fontaine says that at one point in her life she picked cotton to support her father and she never considered herself white trash for doing so. Scarlett returns to Tara and takes up the work of picking cotton, which she considers humiliating slave work. Only Dilsey helps her. Mammy and Pork insist that, as houseworkers, they will not perform field hand labor. Melanie is still too weak for laboring. Still, now that she has food, money, and a horse, Scarlett believes the worst is over. In mid-November the family learns that the Yankee army is again marching toward Tara. Terrified of losing the food in the house, Scarlett sends everyone into the swamp to hide with the animals and the food. She keeps Melanie's baby with her. Scarlett refuses to abandon Tara and meets the Yankees at the front door. A swarm of soldiers pours in around her, destroying everything they do not steal. One soldier tries to take Wade's grandfather's sword, which is now Wade's birthright, but Scarlett persuades the Yankee sergeant to stop him. The enraged soldier runs into the kitchen and sets the place on fire as the Yankees stream out of the house. With great effort, Scarlett and Melanie succeed in putting out the fire. Scarlett's contempt for Melanie once again gives way to grudging admiration. Around Christmas time, a man named Frank Kennedy and a few Confederate soldiers visit Tara, looking for food for the army. Frank tells Scarlett and Melanie that General Sherman has burned Atlanta to the ground, although Aunt Pat's house escaped the destruction. Frank confides in Scarlett that the end is near, and he finally becomes engaged to Scarlett's sister Sullen after years of courtship. By April the war is over, and Scarlett, relieved rather than dejected, makes plans to plant cotton for next year's market. The roads are safe once again, and neighbors help each other get back on their feet. Streams of returning Confederate soldiers begin passing through Tara, and Scarlett grudgingly offers them hospitality, sharing Tara and her food with them. A soldier named Will Benteen, a working-class Georgian with a wooden leg, stays on to help with the plantation. He is a godsend, quietly and competently assisting with the land. He falls in love with Scarlett's sister Karine, whose devotion to her prayer books and memories of Brent Tarleton prevent her from noticing Will's attentions. One day, Uncle Peter, a slave, comes from Aunt Pat's house with a letter from Ashley. Ashley is alive and walking home from Illinois. Anxious weeks pass, and Ashley finally arrives. Melanie runs down the front path to meet him and Scarlett starts to run after her, but Will grabs her skirt to stop her. He gently reminds her that Ashley is Melanie's husband. Scarlett returns to Tara for Gerald's funeral. Will Benteen tells her that Sullen, desperate for more money, tried to trick Gerald into taking the oath of loyalty to the Union. Men who swear loyalty to the Union receive compensation for property lost during the war. Will says that Sullen got Gerald drunk and got him to agree to sign anything. Although drunk, Gerald realized what was about to happen and ripped up the oath. He mounted his horse and rode away. When he tried to jump a fence, his horse pitched him off, killing him upon impact. Will shocks Scarlett by telling her that he plans to marry Sullen so that he can stay at Tara forever. When she sees Tara, Scarlett's heart surges with love. Ashley performs the funeral service and Will asks to say a few words. To keep any of the mourners from criticizing Sullen, Will announces their engagement and asks that no one else speak after him. Old Miss Fontaine tells Scarlett that the secret to success lies in changing with the changing times, rising up after misfortune, and using people and then discarding them. Scarlett finds the speech confusing and dull. After the funeral, Scarlett gives Gerald's gold watch to Pork as a reward for his faithful service. Upon learning that Ashley intends to move to New York with Melanie, Scarlett appeals to him to take a half-interest in the mill and live in Atlanta. Ashley refuses, ashamed to live on her charity and tormented by his love for Scarlett. When Scarlett begins to cry, Melanie rushes into the room. She learns of Scarlett's offer and urges Ashley to accept it in order to repay Scarlett's kindness and let Beau grow up in Atlanta rather than in the hostile North. Ashley accepts the offer at the expense of his honor. After Sullen and Will's wedding, Corinne enters a convent, and Ashley, Melanie, and Beau move into a little house in Atlanta adjacent to Aunt Pat's house. Melanie's optimism, generosity, and adherence to old Southern values make her house the social nucleus for proud Southern families. Ashley proves incompetent at wringing profits from the labor of the freed slaves, so Scarlett announces her intention to lease convicts to work in her mills. Scarlett gives birth to an ugly baby girl and names her Ella Lorena. Scarlett is desperate to get back to the mill, but Frank forbids her to return. Atlanta has become dangerous, and Frank worries for Scarlett's safety. The Yankees, he says, are trying to root out the Ku Klux Klan, and anger has begun to brew among the freed slaves in areas like Shantytown. A one-legged, one-eyed mountain man named Archie begins to work as Scarlett's escort into town. Rude and intimidating, Archie quickly becomes an Atlanta institution, chaperoning women around town. When Archie hears about Scarlett's plan to lease convicts to work in the mills, he threatens to stop assisting her. He tells her he was a convict for 40 years after murdering his adulterous wife, and says that convict leasing is worse than slave ownership. Scarlett learns that the Georgia legislature has refused to ratify a constitutional amendment granting blacks citizenship. Though many Southerners take pride in the legislature's resolve, Scarlett realizes it will make the Yankees even harder on Atlanta. She leases 10 convicts to work in her mills, hiring a Yankee Irishman named Johnny Gallagher as their foreman. Atlanta is appalled at Scarlett's actions, and Archie quits as promised, but Gallagher gets an astonishing amount of work out of his men. To Scarlett's dismay, Gallagher fares far better than Ashley as a manager. Trudging dejectedly from Rhett's jail cell, Scarlett encounters Frank Kennedy in a new buggy. Frank says that he now owns a store and plans to buy a sawmill soon, which would be extremely profitable because of all the rebuilding needed in Atlanta. Despite Frank's engagement to Sullen, Scarlett determines that she must marry Frank in order to pay the taxes on Tara. She tells Frank that Sullen is set to marry another man. Scarlett realizes that, contrary to most well-bred Southerners, she would rather have money than pride. 2 weeks later, Frank marries Scarlett and gives her the money to save Tara. Scarlett ignores Sullen's sadness and the neighbors' malicious gossip. She manipulates Frank into making more profitable business decisions, fending off guilt with her practice of putting off worrying about things. Frank soon falls ill, and Scarlett takes advantage of his immobility, going to the store to see the account books. She quickly realizes that Frank runs the business badly. His friends owe him vast sums of money that he is too embarrassed to collect. Scarlett thinks she could do a much better job in the strictly male world of business and begins to think of acquiring a sawmill. Rhett, who has blackmailed his way out of jail, enters the store and congratulates Scarlett on her marriage. After mocking her for still loving Ashley, Rhett changes his tone and agrees to loan her the money to buy the sawmill as long as she does not use the money to help Ashley. To Frank's chagrin, Scarlett quickly becomes a ruthless businesswoman, devoting all her time to the mill and turning a sizable profit by any means necessary. Scarlett is the only businesswoman in Atlanta, and the city gossips disapprovingly. Embarrassed and afraid of his wife, Frank hopes that a baby will take Scarlett's mind off business. Tony Fontaine, a planter's son from Scarlett's county, arrives one night in a panic. He has killed Jonas Wilkerson and a black man. He explains that Wilkerson was telling freed slaves they have the right to rape white women, and one such slave made a lewd comment to Tony's sister-in-law. Ashley, who accompanied Tony on his revenge mission, advised him to seek help from Scarlett and Frank. Tony leaves, and Scarlett reflects that the South has become a dangerous place. She begins to fear losing everything to the powerful Yankee government and freed slaves, and she pins all her hopes for safety on making money. She tells Frank that she is pregnant. While Frank glows with pride and relief, Scarlett thinks of the Ku Klux Klan, a newly formed organization supposedly intended to protect whites against violent blacks. She feels grateful that Frank is not in the Klan because the government in the North has been gearing up to crush the organization. Scarlett searches for the right man to run the mill while the birth and the baby occupy her. To the horror of old Atlanta, she also begins doing business with the Yankees, although she hates them. She shakes with anger when 3 Yankee women declare in front of Uncle Peter that blacks are untrustworthy. Scarlett begins to run into Rhett frequently, and she drinks brandy to soothe her nerves. News arrives that Gerald is dead, and Scarlett heads home with a heavy heart. Scarlett and Rhett enjoy a lavish New Orleans honeymoon. On their last night, however, Scarlett has a nightmare. She is running through the mist near Tara, searching for something she cannot name. Rhett comforts her, telling her she will get used to being safe. He adds that she can have as much money as she likes for anything she wants, but that he will not spend a cent on her businesses because he does not care to support Ashley Wilkes. Still angry with Scarlett for causing the Klan raid that endangered so many men, the women of Atlanta intend to cut Scarlett and Rhett out of society. Melanie passionately defends Scarlett and prevents the community from shunning her completely. Scarlett supervises the construction of the most lavish mansion in Atlanta and befriends many wealthy and corrupt Republicans, scallywags, and carpetbaggers. She loves being rich, and cares little that the society dedicated to the Old South refuses to attend her parties. Rhett pays the bills, though he regards Scarlett's new social circle with undisguised contempt. He warns her that she will regret severing ties with old Atlanta when the Democrats are back in power, but Scarlett dismisses this possibility. Scarlett generally enjoys her life with Rhett, though he often mucks her and treats her with indifference. One afternoon, Scarlett discovers, to her horror, that she is pregnant. She wants to terminate the pregnancy, but Rhett angrily says that he once saw a woman die while aborting her baby and refuses to allow Scarlett to risk her life. Scarlett gives birth to a daughter, and Rhett stuns everyone with his unabashed love for his daughter. They name her Eugenie Victoria, but when Melanie observes that the baby's eyes are blue like the Bonnie Blue flag, a Confederate flag, the baby's nickname becomes Bonnie Blue Butler. Scarlett goes to the mill to go over the books with Ashley. Ashley indicates that he is jealous of Rhett. Thrilled that Ashley still loves her, Scarlett decides to tell Rhett that she wants separate bedrooms, which implies that she wants to end their sexual relationship. Rhett tells her with indifference that he will look elsewhere for female companionship. After he leaves, Scarlett cries while thinking of everything she will miss about sharing a bed with Rhett, like waking in his arms after a nightmare and long conversations before sleep. Rhett decides that Bonnie must not suffer in Atlanta simply because he and Scarlett have fallen from society's grace. He begins an elaborate campaign to regain the good favor of the old Southern matrons. He also breaks ties with the Republican Party and works to put the Democrats in power. Gradually, old Atlanta comes around and embraces Rhett and Bonnie, though it still scorns Scarlett and her Republican socializing. When she is 2 years old, Bonnie develops a pronounced fear of the dark. Rhett allows Bonnie to sleep in his room with a lit lamp every night. Scarlett's pregnancy brings children to the forefront of the novel for the first time. Beginning with Wade's birth in Chapter 7, Scarlett has been a mother for nearly the entire novel. Until now, however, her children do not play an important role in either Scarlett's life or the plot. Wade is not mentioned for long sections of the novel, though he becomes slightly more prominent in Part 5, and Ella receives only passing mention after her birth. Bonnie, however, appears more often in the novel because of Rhett's love for her. Scarlett has never really loved anyone besides her parents. Her passion for Ashley is more childhood fantasy than love, so it is not surprising that she does not care for her children. Scarlett's instinct for self-preservation is so strong that it leaves little room for her to worry about the preservation of those to whom she feels no attachment. Each time she becomes pregnant, she reacts with a horror that would have been regarded as highly unnatural in her day. Scarlett exhibits none of the natural maternal thought essential to the feminine nature. Scarlett also dislikes her children because they resemble their fathers instead of her. Wade is timid and weak like Charles, and Ella is ugly and silly like Frank. Scarlett cares little for her husbands, so she cares little for the children of her husbands. Bonnie exhibits the selfishness and strong will that Rhett and Scarlett share, so she elicits feeling from Scarlett just as Rhett does. Will returns from a trip to Jonesboro with terrible news. The scalawags and carpetbaggers have raised the taxes on Tara. Scarlett does not have enough money to pay the taxes, so she goes to ask Ashley for advice. He says he cannot help her. With self-loathing, he tells Scarlett he cannot bear to face reality. He misses the Old South. Scarlett tells Ashley that she still loves him and suddenly asks him to escape with her. They kiss passionately, and Ashley tells Scarlett that he loves her but cannot leave Melanie, for he loves his honor more than he loves Scarlett. Placing a clump of Tara's red clay in Scarlett's hands, Ashley tells Scarlett that he knows she loves Tara even more than she loves him. Scarlett remembers her passion for Tara and walks back to the house, vowing never to throw herself at Ashley again. Jonas Wilkerson, the former overseer of Tara, who now works for the Freedmen's Bureau, and Emmy Slattery arrive at Tara dressed in opulent finery. Wilkerson announces his intention to buy the plantation for Emmy, and Scarlett realizes that he is the man responsible for raising the taxes on Tara to drive the O'Haras away. She curses the visitors and orders them to leave. Wilkerson snidely tells Scarlett that she is no longer high and mighty. Scarlett spits at him as he drives away in his fancy carriage. Desperate, Scarlett decides to go to Atlanta to try to marry Rhett Butler. The thought of marriage to Rhett repulses her, but she has heard of his vast funds, which he reportedly stole from the Confederate treasury. Scarlett cannot seduce Rhett looking ragged and poor, but there is no money for a new dress, so she makes one out of Ellen's fine green velvet curtains. She decides that if Rhett does not want to marry her, she will offer to become his mistress if he will save Tara. Mammy agrees to help make the dress, on the condition that Scarlett let her act as chaperone. Scarlett and Mammy arrive to find Atlanta burned nearly beyond recognition. The streets teem with blue-coated Yankee soldiers and freed slaves. At Aunt Pat's house, Scarlett hears of the downfall of nearly all the prominent families in Atlanta. Rhett Butler has been sent to jail for allegedly killing a black man who insulted a white woman. Scarlett is so surprised that she scarcely hears Aunt Pat ask her whether the newly formed Ku Klux Klan is active around Tara. The next morning, Scarlett visits Rhett in prison. She pretends to be well off and tries to seduce him. She nearly succeeds, but he notices the calluses on her overworked hands and guesses her true reasons for coming to see him. He refuses her blunt offer to be his mistress and tells her that even if he wanted to give her money, the Yankees would trace any draft he wrote and confiscate all his wealth. Rhett tells her mockingly that she can attend his hanging, and she leaves filled with bitterness and shame. After the Civil War ends, the events of the novel take place during the era of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the transitional period during which the southern states were rebuilt under a new government and new laws. When the war ended, the Northern-controlled Congress refused to grant seats to newly elected congressmen from the South and took full control of the Reconstruction process. The South felt shamed and helpless, forced to live under what it perceived as foreign rule by the North. For Scarlett and her friends, Reconstruction proves more painful than the war itself. During the war, even the most painful losses in battle are made bearable by the spirit of rebellion. After the war, however, defeat sours everyone. The South can no longer take pride or comfort in its spirit of rebellion. Three types of people dominate the novel's portrayal of Reconstruction: Republican officials, Northerners in a South that was solidly Democratic; scalawags, Southerners who traitorously supported the Republican Party after the war; and carpetbaggers, Northerners who came to the South after the war in search of power and profit. The old hierarchy turned upside down when Congress denied the right to vote to many Southerners who participated in the war and quickly granted suffrage to black men. The Republican governments in the South, led by scalawags and carpetbaggers, rode roughshod over the once mighty plantation owners and aristocrats of the South. Scarlett's friends resent the power of the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency designed to protect the interests of freed slaves, whom the Southerners view as ignorant and incompetent. Scarlett herself confronts the power of the government when her old employee Jonas Wilkerson, employed at the local Freedmen's Bureau, easily manipulates the tax code to increase the taxes on Tara illegally in the hope of obtaining the plantation for himself. 16-year-old Scarlett O'Hara lounges on the front porch of Tara, her father's plantation in northern Georgia, in the spring of 1861. She flirts with the 19-year-old twin brothers Brent and Stuart Talton. The boys excitedly discuss the rumors that a war will soon break out between the North and the South. Scarlett changes the subject to the next day's barbecue and ball at the 12 Oaks plantation. Brent and Stuart tell her that Ashley Wilkes, the son of the proprietor of 12 Oaks, will announce his engagement to Melanie Hamilton, his cousin, at the ball. Scarlett, who wants Ashley for herself, tries to act normally but cannot maintain her vivaciousness. The twins leave, baffled by Scarlett's sudden silence. Distressed by the news of Ashley's engagement, Scarlett hurries to the road to wait for her father, who has gone visiting at 12 Oaks. Gerald O'Hara rides into view at breakneck speed and jumps a fence. Scarlett teasingly reminds him that he promised her mother, Ellen, not to jump fences, but she vows to keep his reckless behavior a secret. At Scarlett's probing, Gerald confirms that Ashley plans to marry Melanie. He sharply warns Scarlett that she and Ashley would make a terrible match. Gerald says the Wilkeses are too interested in music and poetry, and though Ashley excels at masculine pursuits like riding and shooting, his heart is not in them. On the porch, Scarlett and her father encounter Ellen, who is rushing out to help baptize Emmy Slattery's dying newborn. Mammy, an old slave who has been with Ellen since childhood, does not think Ellen should help the unwed Emmy, whose white trash family lives adjacent to the O'Hara plantation. Scarlett thinks about her mother's gentle grace and good breeding, so different from her own willful and passionate ways. Scarlett inherited her temperament from Gerald, who fled his unremarkable life in Ireland after killing another man in a feud. Gerald won his first slave, Pork, and his plantation in a poker game. Though lacking good breeding, Gerald won over the neighbors' hearts with his kindness. Ellen, a placid, serious woman from the aristocratic Robillard family of Savannah, agreed to marry Gerald after the death of her first love, her cousin Philippe. She blamed her family for driving Philippe away from Savannah and from her, and out of frustration and revenge she married the low-class Gerald. Scarlett, the oldest and most strong-willed O'Hare daughter, lacks beauty. Still, she has learned ladylike behavior from Ellen and Mammy and has used her charms to become the most pursued belle in the neighborhood. That day, Gerald has purchased a slave named Dilsey from 12 Oaks so that Dilsey can be with Pork, who is her husband. At dinner that night, Dilsey thanks Gerald and offers Prissy, her daughter, to be Scarlett's personal maid. Ellen returns late from the Slatter's house. As Ellen leads the nightly prayer, Scarlett concocts a plan to win Ashley from Melanie. She resolves to tell Ashley she loves him at the barbecue. She feels sure that when Ashley knows her true feelings he will elope with her. Scarlett overhears Ellen telling Gerald that Jonas Wilkerson, Tara's Yankee overseer, must be dismissed. Scarlett realizes that Wilkerson was the father of Emmy Slattery's dead child. The first chapters have begun with event present the pre-Civil War South. The O'Haras and the Wilkeses are upper-class, wealthy, white plantation owners who mix traditional values like chivalry, honor, and propriety with a pioneer-style enthusiasm for drinking, horseback riding, and shooting. Family and money rule the social hierarchy, as we see by the neighbors' initial hesitancy to accept Gerald O'Hara. Even so, Gerald's ultimate acceptance by the neighbors shows that a devotion to the South and to its culture along with a good marriage can secure respect for a self-made man such as he. The slaves also live in a set social order. Houseworkers outrank field hands and take pride in their higher status. For poor whites like the Slatterys, called white trash by wealthy whites and poor slaves alike, survival depends on the charity of rich neighbors. Pride permeates even the lowest rungs of society, however, and the Slatterys refuse to be bought out of their land. The characters also take great pride in the South, and in the weeks before the war this pride swells among the young men who have signed up to fight against the North. The Southern society of the novel expects men and women to conform to specific gender roles. The narrator notes that the man owns the property but the woman manages it. The man takes credit for managing the property, and the woman then praises his cleverness. Owning property gives men rights and power, but they share little of the reward that results from the women's hard work. Women have all the work and responsibility of running the property, but enjoy only those rights that men deem to grant them. The narrator stresses the absurdity of these gender roles, sarcastically saying, "He man roared like a bull when a splinter was in his finger, and the woman muffled the moans of childbirth, lest she disturb him." In this society, men expect women to suppress their needs and desires and focus attention on the men. Women are not even allowed to take credit for their own intelligence, bravery, and strength. By May of 1864, General Sherman's Yankee Army has fought its way into Georgia and is dangerously close to Atlanta. Red infuriates Dr. Meade by declaring that the Confederacy will not hold the Yankees back. Everyone in Atlanta clings to a faith in the Confederacy. As the war creeps closer, the trains deliver wounded and dying soldiers by the thousands. Scarlett feels that she can no longer bear her work and sneaks away from the hospital. She encounters Red, who is impeccably dressed despite the wartime scarcity. He drives her back to Peachtree Street. On the way, they encounter a group of marching slaves, and Scarlett recognizes Big Sam, the old foreman at Tara. He tells her proudly that the slaves are being sent to dig trenches for the gentlemen and women to hide in when the Yankees come. Scarlett knows that they are really digging the trenches for the Confederate Army to fight off the Yankees. Red drives on and teases Scarlett about how she must secretly want him to kiss her. He says he does not make advances toward her because she childishly clings to her love for Ashley. Scarlett becomes so angry that she makes Red stop the carriage and let her out. Atlanta is under siege, and even old men and young boys are called upon to fight. John Wilkes, Ashley's elderly father, joins the militia. Gerald stays home only because of his battered knee. The Yankees outnumber the Confederates, and dying soldiers pour into the city, collapsing on lawns and crowding into houses. The citizens of Atlanta begin to flee in panic, and Petit Pat joins the exodus to Macon. Scarlett longs to go home to Tara, but she must remain with Melanie, who is too pregnant to relocate. Scarlett knows nothing about childbirth, but Prissy says that she has helped with many deliveries. The Yankees sever all rail lines but one. Shells hammer Atlanta. Scarlett is frantic and Melanie lies in bed sick. Uncle Henry stops by on a leave of absence to tell Scarlett that John Wilkes has been killed. Red finds Scarlett crying on her porch. He tells her that he likes her but does not love her and asks if she will become his mistress. Scarlett storms upstairs furiously. After 30 days of siege, quiet falls. The Yankees move to capture the Jonesboro rail line, which lies very near Tara. Scarlett's terror grows when she receives a letter from Gerald saying that Ellen and both of Scarlett's sisters have typhoid fever. By the 1st of September, Scarlett does not know whether the Yankees are at Tara or whether her family is still alive. She longs to go home, but she will not break her promise to Ashley by leaving Melanie. Melanie tells Scarlett the baby will come very soon and makes Scarlett promise to take the baby if Melanie dies. Throughout Part 2, Mitchell builds suspense by focusing on the war as it inches closer to Atlanta. She describes every new development in the war, which begins to take on central importance in the lives of the characters. When the battle at Gettysburg begins, the characters and the narrator start paying closer attention to news of the war. Nearly every family Scarlett knows loses a relative, and she herself knows many of the boys who die. After the Battle of Gettysburg, The war takes a decisive turn in favor of the Yankees, and the old carefree optimism fades from Atlanta. The city runs short on food and clothing. Scarlett, once so blithely ignorant about the war, now feels surrounded by its effects. Ashley is captured, and masses of injured men fill the hospital where Scarlett works. She cannot escape the war's horrors. Mitchell shows us the war as Scarlett sees it, describing the progress of the conflict, but never depicting a single battle scene. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of the Union Army, dispatched General William Tecumseh Sherman with a force of 100,000 men to topple the last stronghold of the Confederacy, the relatively untouched states of Georgia and the Carolinas. After conquering Atlanta, Sherman set out on his famous march from Atlanta to the sea. During his march, Sherman broke the backbone of Confederate resistance and paved the way for Northern victory. Sherman, who is also credited with the saying, "War is hell," considered it his duty not merely to defeat the Confederate Army, but to crush the South beyond repair. As a result, his troops waged economic warfare against the people they conquered, destroying property, confiscating food and livestock, burning crops and houses, and damaging railroad systems. This scorched earth campaign won Sherman a fearsome reputation throughout the South. The characters in Gone with the Wind circulate many horror stories about Yankees, accusing them of rape, dismemberment, and burning. Their stories reflect the ravages wrought by Sherman's commitment to all-out destruction. On a May morning in 1862, Scarlett, Prissy, and Wade arrive in Atlanta to visit Melanie and Aunt Piti Pat. Atlanta, her railroad hub, has sprouted army departments, hospitals, and foundries during the war. At the Hamilton House on Peachtree Street, Piti Pat and Melanie are thrilled to see Scarlett. Uncle Henry, Piti Pat's brother, talks to Scarlett about Charles's fortune, which is now Scarlett's. The hustle and energy revive Scarlett. Her only complaint is that she must do volunteer nursing work in the soldiers' hospitals, which are full of sweaty, wounded men that stink of gangrene. The hospital holds a fundraising bazaar, but as a widow and mourning, Scarlett cannot attend without breaching decorum. Unlike the other widows, she thinks it unfair that she works like a field hand to prepare for the bazaar but cannot attend. At the last moment, Scarlett and Melanie are called in to work at a booth. At the bazaar, Scarlett is shocked by her own lack of patriotism during the speeches about the glorious Confederate cause. She longs to dance. Rhett Butler, now a famous blockade runner for the South, appears and teases her about her marriage to Charles. Dr. Meade, Atlanta's foremost citizen, sends around a collection basket to encourage women to donate their jewelry. Scarlett donates her hated wedding ring. Melanie mistakes Scarlett's action for courage and throws her own wedding ring into the basket. Dr. Meade scandalously proposes that gentlemen must bid to dance with the lady of their choice in order to raise money for the hospital. As a widow, Scarlett is strictly forbidden to dance, but Rhett bids $150 in gold on her. To the shock of the crowd, Scarlett accepts and hurries to the dance floor. Rhett tells Scarlett that he admires her beauty and spirit and that he knows the cause bores her as it bores him. Scarlett pretends to be angry, but she knows that what he says is true. The next morning, Atlanta buzzes with gossip about Scarlett's shocking behavior. Piti Pat says that Rhett is a terrible man, but forgives him when he sends a gift, Melanie's wedding ring, which he bought back. Gerald arrives to confront Rhett and takes Scarlett back to Terra in disgrace. He leaves to talk to Rhett and returns in the middle of the night, drunk and penniless from playing poker. In the morning, Scarlett promises to keep his behavior a secret as long as he allows her to stay in Atlanta. He agrees. The following week, Scarlett sneaks into Melanie's room to read a letter Melanie recently received from Ashley. In it, Ashley discusses his doubts about the war, but Scarlett pays little attention to his soul-searching questions. She is simply relieved that Ashley has not written Melanie a love letter. Scarlett puts away the letter, convinced that Ashley still loves her. Mitchell divides Gone with the Wind into 63 chapters, dividing those chapters into 5 parts. Each new part begins with a shift in Scarlett's life and in the life of the South. Chapter 8, the first chapter of Part 2, marks the end of Scarlett's comfortable and privileged life at Tara and the beginning of her consciousness of the Civil War. Though the war actually starts in Chapter 7, Scarlett does not move to Atlanta until Chapter 8, and it is only in Atlanta that she begins to feel the reality of the war. Part 2 also marks the beginning of Scarlett's life as a 17-year-old widow. Earlier, back at Tara, gala parties and masses of admirers surround her. In Atlanta, her social life changes entirely. Although Scarlett knows some people in Atlanta, she now spends her time with Melanie, Petit Pat, and older married or widowed women.